Harlem, New York, February 1958. Isaiah Cole had been Bumpy Johnson's shadow for 11 years, the quiet man who stood 3 steps behind the king of Harlem, watching everything, saying nothing. In all those years, Isaiah had never drawn his weapon, never needed to. His presence alone was enough. But on the night of February 14th, 1958, everything changed in the space of a single heartbeat. A trusted ally raised a gun toward Bumpy's head. Isaiah had less than a second to decide. When the smoke cleared, one man was dead, a conspiracy was exposed, and Harlem would never be the same. This is the story of the second that changed history. The night Isaiah Cole proved that loyalty isn't measured in words. It's measured in what you're willing to do when the moment demands everything. Chapter 1. The Shadow. Isaiah Cole had learned to become invisible long before he ever met Bumpy Johnson. The skill had saved his life in Korea, where a black soldier from Harlem discovered that survival depended not on being the loudest or the strongest, but on being the one who saw everything while remaining unseen himself. He had returned from that frozen hell in 1947 with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and the understanding that America didn't care what he had sacrificed for a country that still treated him as less than human. The medals gathered dust in a drawer. The skills he had developed stayed sharp as razors. Bumpy Johnson had recognized those skills immediately when Isaiah walked into a Harlem social club in the winter of 1947, looking for work that his military service should have provided, but that civilian employers refused to offer a colored veteran. Isaiah was 23 years old then, lean and watchful, carrying himself with the coiled readiness of someone who had learned that death could arrive from any direction without warning. Bumpy had been building his organization's security apparatus and needed men who understood protection as more than simple muscle. Isaiah Cole understood protection the way a surgeon understands anatomy. The arrangement that developed over the following 11 years was built on mutual recognition of qualities that required no verbal acknowledgement. Isaiah became Bumpy's shadow, the man who stood 3 steps behind the king of Harlem at every public appearance, who scanned every room before Bumpy entered it, who noticed the small details that other men missed because they were too busy being noticed themselves. Isaiah's value lay precisely in his invisibility, his ability to observe without being observed, to assess threats while appearing to be nothing more than another anonymous figure in Bumpy Johnson's extensive entourage. By February of 1958, Isaiah Cole was 34 years old, a tall African-American man whose lean frame concealed strength that only became apparent when circumstances required its application. His face carried the weathered quality of someone who had seen things that most people could only imagine, eyes that missed nothing while revealing nothing, features arranged in an expression of perpetual calm that never varied regardless of what was happening around him. He spoke rarely, never raised his voice, and had not drawn his weapon in the 11 years he had served as Bumpy's primary protector. His reputation in Harlem's underworld was built entirely on what people believed he could do rather than on anything they had witnessed him doing. The relationship between Isaiah and Bumpy Johnson, the legendary African-American gangster who controlled Harlem's criminal enterprises, had deepened over the years into something that transcended the usual boundaries between employer and employee. Bumpy trusted Isaiah with his life in the most literal sense possible, understood that the quiet man who stood behind him would die before allowing harm to reach him. Isaiah, in turn, had found in Bumpy something he had never expected to find after returning from Korea: purpose that extended beyond mere survival, belonging that validated skills the civilian world had rejected along with the veteran who possessed them. Isaiah had saved Bumpy's life twice before in those 11 years, though neither instance had required violence. The first time involved noticing a waiter whose hands trembled slightly as he approached Bumpy's table, a detail that led to the discovery of a concealed knife and the quiet removal of an assassin before any harm could occur. The second time involved recognizing the face of a supposed delivery driver as someone who had previously worked for a rival organization, a recognition that prevented an ambush before it could be executed. Both saves had been accomplished through observation and prevention, through the application of watchfulness rather than weaponry. The winter of 1958 brought tensions to Harlem that exceeded anything Isaiah had observed in his years of service. Someone within Bumpy's organization was feeding information to enemies, betraying operations that should have been secure, providing intelligence that allowed rivals and police to anticipate moves that should have been unpredictable. The evidence was circumstantial but consistent. Raids that arrived too quickly, deals that collapsed too conveniently, patterns that suggested insider knowledge being shared with outsiders whose interests opposed everything Bumpy had built. Isaiah watched everyone more carefully during those months, applying the same intensity to Bumpy's inner circle that he normally reserved for external threats. The betrayer had to be someone with access to sensitive information, someone whose position allowed them to observe without being suspected, someone who had earned trust that was now being weaponized against the man who had granted it. The search for this traitor consumed Isaiah's attention while never distracting from his primary responsibility of keeping Bumpy Johnson alive. The weight of this dual vigilance would have crushed most men, the constant alertness required to protect against external threats while simultaneously hunting an internal enemy who could be anyone in the organization. Isaiah carried this weight without visible strain, his composure maintained through discipline that had been forged in Korean winters where showing weakness meant dying from it. Bumpy noticed the additional tension his bodyguard carried, recognized its source without needing to discuss it, appreciated the dedication that drove Isaiah to expand his protective mandate without being asked. The streets of Harlem whispered with rumors about the information leak, speculation about who might be responsible and what their motivations might be. Isaiah listened to these whispers through sources he had cultivated over 11 years of service. People who talked to him because they trusted him, and people who talked to him because they feared the consequences of remaining silent. The intelligence he gathered through these channels supplemented his direct observations, building a picture of betrayal that grew clearer with each passing week. Chapter 2. The Traitor Among Them. Marcus Webb had served as Bumpy Johnson's financial advisor for 8 years, a position that placed him at the intersection of legitimate business and criminal enterprise that characterized Bumpy's sophisticated operation. Webb was 41 years old, a light-skinned African-American man with refined features that reflected the mixed heritage common among Harlem's educated elite. He had graduated from Columbia University with a degree in accounting, had worked briefly for legitimate firms before discovering that his talents commanded higher prices in markets that operated outside conventional regulations. His introduction to Bumpy's organization had come through mutual acquaintances who recognized that both men could benefit from the other's capabilities. Webb's role involved managing the legitimate business fronts that concealed and laundered the proceeds of Bumpy's criminal enterprises, maintaining financial records that could withstand scrutiny from authorities while simultaneously tracking the actual flow of money through channels that official documents never reflected. He was educated where most of Bumpy's associates were street smart, articulate where they were blunt, presentable in contexts where their presence would have attracted unwanted attention. Webb served as the respectable face of an operation that required respectability as much as it required muscle. The trust Bumpy placed in Marcus Webb had been earned through years of reliable service, through financial management that had increased the organization's prosperity while minimizing exposure to legal complications. Webb knew things about Bumpy's operations that only a handful of people knew, had access to information that could destroy everything Bumpy had built if it fell into the wrong hands. This access was precisely what made Webb valuable. It was also what made him dangerous if his loyalty ever wavered. Isaiah Cole began watching Marcus Webb more closely in December of 1957, prompted by observations that seemed insignificant individually but accumulated into a pattern that his trained instincts couldn't ignore. Webb had acquired a new watch, an expensive piece that exceeded what his known salary could reasonably support. Webb's patterns had changed subtly, meetings at unusual hours, conversations conducted in locations away from the organization's normal gathering places, nervous behaviors that surfaced when certain topics were discussed. These details meant nothing to people who weren't looking for them. Isaiah was always looking. The surveillance Isaiah conducted over the following weeks revealed connections that confirmed his suspicions while exposing the scope of betrayal that exceeded anything he had anticipated. Webb was meeting regularly with a white man whose face Isaiah eventually identified as Detective Frank Harrigan, a corrupt Irish cop whose loyalties belonged to the Italian families that had been seeking to expand their influence in Harlem's profitable rackets. The meetings occurred in locations carefully selected to avoid observation. Conversations that Isaiah couldn't hear, but whose implications were clear from the body language and the exchanges of envelopes that accompanied them. Isaiah brought his findings to Bumpy Johnson on a January evening when the two men could speak privately without fear of observation. Bumpy listened with the controlled stillness that characterized his response to serious matters, his expression revealing nothing while his eyes communicated understanding of what Isaiah's report meant. Marcus Webb, the trusted financial advisor, the educated gentleman who had managed Bumpy's money for 8 years, was selling information to enemies who intended to use it to destroy everything Bumpy had built. Bumpy's initial response was reluctance to accept what the evidence demonstrated. Webb had been loyal for so long, had been trusted with so much, had given no indication of dissatisfaction that might have motivated betrayal. Perhaps Isaiah had misinterpreted what he observed. Perhaps there were explanations that didn't involve treachery. Bumpy ordered Isaiah to continue watching Webb closely, but to take no action until the situation became clearer. The order reflected hope that Isaiah's conclusions might prove mistaken, hope that Bumpy himself recognized as wishful thinking even as he expressed it. The clarity that Bumpy requested arrived through continued surveillance that left no room for alternative explanations. Isaiah observed Webb meeting with Harrigan 3 more times over the following weeks, observed envelopes exchanging hands in both directions, observed Webb reviewing documents that he then photographed with a small camera before returning them to their proper locations. The final confirmation came through a contact Isaiah had cultivated within the police department, a source who revealed that Harrigan had been promising Italian associates that Bumpy Johnson's operation would be vulnerable for takeover within months, that inside information was being provided by someone who knew everything about Bumpy's business. The conspiracy was comprehensive. Webb was selling detailed intelligence about Bumpy's operations, finances, and security arrangements. The Italians were planning to use this information to systematically dismantle Bumpy's organization while positioning themselves to assume control of Harlem's criminal enterprises. Webb had been promised a percentage of the new operation, wealth, and position that far exceeded what his current role provided. The betrayal was motivated by ambition that loyalty had constrained for 8 years before finally overwhelming the bonds that should have held it in check. Isaiah documented everything he observed, creating a record that would support whatever action Bumpy eventually decided to take. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern unmistakable, the conclusion inescapable. Marcus Webb, the educated gentleman who had managed millions of dollars for Bumpy's organization, who had sat at Bumpy's table and shared Bumpy's confidence, was planning to participate in his employer's murder and profit from the chaos that would follow. The betrayal was not merely professional, but personal, a violation of trust that demanded response proportional to its magnitude. The question that remained was timing. Bumpy now accepted the reality of Webb's treachery, but hesitated to act until he understood the full scope of the conspiracy and could address it comprehensively rather than piecemeal. Eliminating Webb would solve one problem while potentially alerting other conspirators to flee or accelerate their plans. The situation required patience that contradicted every instinct Isaiah possessed, restraint that felt like complicity in the threat that grew more dangerous with each passing day. Isaiah understood Bumpy's reasoning even while disagreeing with its application. A premature move against Webb might expose the organization to dangers that patience could avoid. But patience also carried risks. The possibility that Webb might act before Bumpy was ready to respond, that the conspiracy might advance beyond the point where intervention could succeed. Every day that passed without action was a day when everything could fall apart without warning. Isaiah maintained his vigilance with intensity that exceeded anything he had previously sustained, watching Webb with attention that bordered on obsession while continuing to protect Bumpy from the conventional threats that never stopped requiring management. Chapter 3, Valentine's Night. February 14th, 1958 arrived with the bitter cold that characterized New York winters and with plans for a private dinner that Bumpy Johnson hosted annually for his inner circle. The gathering occurred in an Italian restaurant in Harlem, whose owner owed Bumpy favors that ensured absolute privacy and discretion. The upstairs private room accommodated 8 of Bumpy's most trusted associates, men whose loyalty had been demonstrated through years of service and whose presence at this annual dinner signified their status within the organization's hierarchy. Marcus Webb received his customary invitation, his inclusion reflecting a trust that evidence had proven misplaced, but that Bumpy had chosen not to revoke until the moment was right. Isaiah Cole positioned himself by the door of the private room as the dinner commenced, occupying his customary location where he could observe everything occurring within while monitoring the single entrance through which any threat would have to approach. His presence was so routine that most of Bumpy's associates no longer noticed him, their attention focused on the food and conversation and the business that such gatherings always involved. Isaiah preferred this invisibility, understood that his effectiveness depended on being overlooked by everyone except Bumpy himself, who acknowledged his shadow with a slight nod as the evening began. The dinner proceeded through its customary rhythms, appetizers giving way to main courses, wine flowing freely, conversations ranging from business matters to personal anecdotes that demonstrated the camaraderie these men had developed through years of shared enterprise. Bumpy Johnson presided over the gathering with the easy authority that had made him Harlem's undisputed king, his presence commanding attention without demanding it, his contributions to conversation reflecting intelligence that exceeded the formal education he had never received. The evening seemed indistinguishable from the annual dinners that had preceded it. Isaiah watched Marcus Webb throughout the meal with attention that never became obvious observation. Webb was sweating despite the room's comfortable temperature, moisture visible on his forehead that he dabbed periodically with a handkerchief. His hands moved with nervous frequency to his jacket, touching the fabric as if reassuring himself that something was where it was supposed to be. His contributions to conversation were briefer than usual, his laughter slightly delayed, as if he were processing information more slowly than circumstances required. These details screamed danger to Isaiah's trained perceptions, while remaining invisible to everyone else at the table. The dessert course arrived with the ceremonial presentation that the restaurant's owner considered appropriate for Bumpy Johnson's gatherings. Elaborate confections carried by waiters who had been personally vetted before being allowed into the private room. Webb excused himself as the desserts were being distributed, mentioning a need to use the restroom with casualness that didn't quite conceal the tension underlying his movements. He rose from his seat and walked toward the door, passing within arm's reach of Isaiah without acknowledging the bodyguard's presence. Isaiah allowed 30 seconds to pass before following, moving with the unhurried deliberation that characterized all his movements while maintaining awareness of exactly where Webb was heading. The hallway outside the private room led to restrooms at one end and to a service area at the other. Webb turned not toward the restrooms, but toward the service area, moving with purpose that contradicted his stated destination. Isaiah followed at a distance that allowed observation without detection, watching as Webb stopped beside a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall and retrieved something that had been concealed behind it. The object was a revolver, its metal gleaming briefly in the hallway's dim light before Webb slipped it inside his jacket. The weapon had been planted in advance, hidden in a location where security sweeps wouldn't detect it, positioned for retrieval at a moment when Webb could excuse himself without arousing suspicion. The discovery confirmed everything Isaiah had feared while leaving no time for anything except immediate response. Webb was returning to the private room with a gun, returning to the dinner where Bumpy Johnson sat unsuspecting among associates who trusted the man now walking toward them with murder in his intentions. Isaiah followed Webb back toward the private room, closing the distance between them while maintaining the silent footsteps that Korea had taught him and 11 years of service had perfected. His hand moved inside his own jacket, fingers closing around the grip of the weapon he had carried daily but had never needed to use. The weight of the gun was familiar, but the intention now forming in his mind was not. In the space of the next few seconds, Isaiah Cole would have to decide whether he was capable of killing a man to save another man's life. Chapter 4. The Second. Marcus Webb re-entered the private dining room with the casual demeanor of a man returning from a routine absence, his movements betraying no indication of the weapon concealed beneath his jacket or the violence he intended to unleash within moments. The other dinner guests barely acknowledged his return, their attention focused on desserts and conversations that would continue only as long as Bumpy Johnson remained alive to host them. Webb moved around the table, positioning himself near Bumpy's chair, selecting an angle that would allow a shot to the back of the head from close range with minimal chance of missing. Isaiah entered the room 3 seconds behind Webb, his eyes locked on the man whose intentions he understood completely and whose actions he was now committed to preventing through whatever means the moment required. The distance between them was approximately 12 feet, the distance between Webb and Bumpy approximately 4 feet. The geometry of the situation allowed no possibility of reaching Webb before he could draw and fire, if that was his choice. The only option available was the option Isaiah had hoped for 11 years he would never need to exercise. Webb's hand moved inside his jacket. The movement was smooth, practiced, the motion of someone who had rehearsed this moment until it became automatic. His fingers closed around the revolver's grip. The weapon began emerging from its concealment, rising toward a target that still remained unaware of the death approaching from behind. The other dinner guests noticed nothing, their attention elsewhere, their assumptions about Webb's trustworthiness preventing them from processing warning signals that should have been obvious. Time decelerated in Isaiah's perception, the phenomenon familiar from combat in Korea, where life-or-death situations compressed into moments that seemed to extend indefinitely while actually lasting fractions of seconds. He saw Webb's gun clearing the jacket fabric. He saw the barrel beginning to rise toward Bumpy's head. He saw the trigger finger positioning itself for the shot that would end the life of the man Isaiah had protected for 11 years. The moment demanded response that thought was too slow to provide. Only training could save Bumpy Johnson now. Isaiah drew his weapon with a fluid motion that thousands of practice repetitions had made instinctive, the movement beginning before conscious decision had fully formed, muscle memory taking control while rational thought struggled to catch up. His arm extended, the barrel finding its target with precision that required no aiming, alignment achieved through proprioception rather than sight. Webb's gun was still rising when Isaiah's gun leveled on Webb's center mass. Webb's finger was still tightening on the trigger when Isaiah's finger completed the same motion first. The gunshot shattered the civilized atmosphere of the private dining room with violence that seemed to belong to a different world than the one where wealthy criminals had been peacefully consuming dessert moments earlier. The bullet traveled 12 feet in a fraction of a second, struck Marcus Webb in the center of his chest, transferred energy that transformed a living man into a dying one before the sound of the shot had finished echoing off the walls. Webb's own weapon discharged as he fell, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling as his intended aim collapsed along with his body. Marcus Webb hit the floor with the finality that death imposes on all its recipients, his expensive suit absorbing blood that spread across the restaurant's wooden floorboards, his eyes still open but seeing nothing, his hands still gripping a weapon that would never fire the shot it had been meant to deliver. The entire sequence, from Webb reaching for his gun to Webb dying on the floor, had occupied less than 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Isaiah Cole had saved Bumpy Johnson's life by taking another man's life, had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed regardless of how justified the crossing had been. The room erupted in chaos as 8 men processed what had just occurred, chairs overturning as dinner guests dove for cover, or reached for weapons, or simply froze in shock of violence that had materialized without warning. Bumpy Johnson alone remained still, his body having registered the gunshot behind him, while his mind calculated implications with a speed that had kept him alive through decades in a profession where miscalculation meant death. He turned slowly to observe Webb's body, then raised his eyes to Isaiah, who still stood with his weapon extended toward a target that no longer required targeting. The other dinner guests recovered from their initial shock and began processing the scene before them. Webb lay dead on the floor, his weapon visible beside his outstretched hand, his position behind Bumpy's chair, making his intentions unmistakable to anyone who examined the evidence. Isaiah had fired from the doorway, had crossed the entire room with a single bullet that found its target with precision that allowed no margin for error. The skill displayed was extraordinary, the kind of marksmanship that required both natural talent and years of practice to develop. Bumpy's associates looked at Isaiah with new understanding, seeing for the first time the warrior that the quiet bodyguard had always concealed behind his mask of professional detachment. 11 years of silent service had created assumptions about Isaiah's capabilities that this moment shattered completely. He wasn't merely a watchful presence who deterred threats through observation. He was a weapon, perfectly maintained and precisely deployed when the moment demanded its use. Webb's dying breaths produced words that confirmed everything Isaiah's investigation had uncovered, fragmentary confessions about the Italians and Harrigan, and the plan that would have succeeded if not for the bodyguard's intervention. The conspiracy had been scheduled to conclude tonight. Webb's assassination of Bumpy intended to create chaos that the Italian families would exploit to assume control of Harlem's criminal enterprises. Webb had expected to become a partner in the new order. Instead, he became a corpse on a restaurant floor, his ambitions dying with him. Chapter 5. The Aftermath. The immediate aftermath of a shooting required responses that Bumpy Johnson's organization had developed through years of operating in an environment where violence occasionally became necessary and its consequences always required management. The restaurant's owner was summoned and compensated for the disruption while being reminded that his continued prosperity depended on absolute discretion. The body was removed through service entrances, while witnesses were reminded of the benefits of forgetting what they had observed. Within 2 hours, the private dining room showed no evidence that anything unusual had occurred within its walls. Bumpy Johnson drew Isaiah Cole aside, while his other associates managed the logistics of concealment, leading the bodyguard to a small office where they could speak without observation. The two men stood facing each other in silence for a long moment. Bumpy studying the face of the man who had just killed to save him. Isaiah processing the reality of what he had done while maintaining the composed exterior that defined his professional identity. The silence communicated understanding that words would have diminished. Bumpy spoke first, his voice carrying the quiet intensity that characterized his most serious moments. Isaiah had served him for 11 years without ever pulling the trigger. Now that record was ended, that threshold crossed, that burden assumed. The gratitude Bumpy felt was genuine, but so was his recognition of what the act had cost the man who performed it. Killing changed people in ways that couldn't be predicted or reversed. Bumpy knew this from personal experience. He wondered if Isaiah had known it before tonight. Isaiah's response was minimal, a few words acknowledging that he had done what the moment required, that no other option had presented itself, that the outcome was preferable to the alternative that would have occurred if he had hesitated. The words were accurate without being complete. Isaiah was experiencing emotions that his composure concealed, processing the reality of having taken a life in a way that combat in Korea had never quite forced him to process. Soldiers killed enemies. What Isaiah had killed was a man he had known for 8 years, had spoken with countless times, had never suspected until recently of the betrayal that had made his death necessary. The investigation that followed Webb's death revealed the full scope of conspiracy that Isaiah's surveillance had only partially uncovered. Documents in Webb's possession detailed the intelligence he had provided to Detective Harrigan and the Italian families, records of every secret he had sold and every payment he had received. The conspiracy had been comprehensive, designed to dismantle Bumpy's operations systematically while positioning the Italians to assume control of Harlem's criminal enterprises. Webb's death had not merely saved Bumpy's life. It had exposed and terminated a plot that would have destroyed everything Bumpy had built. Detective Frank Harrigan presented a different challenge than Webb had presented, a white cop whose elimination would attract attention that the organization needed to avoid. Bumpy's response was elegant rather than violent. Evidence of Harrigan's corruption was compiled and delivered to authorities whose commitment to honest policing exceeded the detective's commitment to criminal partnership. Harrigan faced investigation, prosecution, and eventual imprisonment for crimes that would have remained concealed if Webb had succeeded in killing Bumpy before his conspiracy could be fully exposed. The Italian families that had financed Webb's betrayal received messages delivered through intermediaries who understood that Bumpy's restraint was a choice rather than a necessity. Their inside man was dead. Their corrupt detective was facing prosecution. Their plans for Harlem had been exposed and terminated. Any further attempts to encroach on Bumpy's territory would be met with responses that would make Webb's death seem merciful by comparison. The families, calculating that the costs of continued conflict exceeded the potential benefits of success, withdrew their ambitions from Harlem and focused their attention on territories whose rulers were less capable of defending them. Bumpy Johnson's position actually strengthened in the aftermath of the assassination attempt, his survival demonstrating that his organization's security remained impenetrable despite the most sophisticated internal betrayal. The story of what had happened spread through Harlem's underworld with the embellishments that such stories always accumulated. Isaiah Cole's role growing with each retelling until the quiet bodyguard became a figure of legendary capability whose intervention had saved the king of Harlem from certain death. The reputation that Isaiah had built on potential was now confirmed by action. Chapter 6: The Legend. The transformation of Isaiah Cole's reputation from silent protector to proven killer occurred whether he welcomed it or not. His action in the restaurant's private dining room becoming part of Harlem's mythology in ways that his previous anonymity had specifically been designed to prevent. People who had never noticed him before now looked at him with awareness that he had earned through violence rather than through the watchfulness that had been his actual profession. The shadow had stepped into light, and the light revealed capabilities that made other men uncomfortable even when they benefited from Isaiah's continued service. Isaiah struggled privately with what he had done, even while accepting publicly the recognition his action had generated. The weight of taking a life pressed on him in ways that surprised him given his military experience, in ways that suggested the Korean War had not actually prepared him for killing a man whose face he knew, whose voice he remembered, whose presence he had tolerated for years before that presence became a threat requiring elimination. Combat had been impersonal, enemies defined by uniforms rather than by individual identities. Webb had been a person before he became a target, and that personhood refused to disappear simply because the threat had been neutralized. Bumpy recognized the burden Isaiah was carrying and addressed it during a private conversation several weeks after the shooting, sharing experiences from his own history that demonstrated understanding earned through similar struggles. Bumpy had killed men over the decades of his criminal career, had made choices that haunted him even when those choices had been necessary, had learned that the weight of such actions never entirely disappeared, but could be managed if one understood that the burden was part of the price paid for protecting what mattered. Violence was never free. Its costs appeared in souls rather than in ledgers, but the accounting was equally precise. The lesson Bumpy offered was not absolution, but perspective. Isaiah had killed to protect, had exercised violence in service of preservation rather than destruction, had made a choice that saved a life while taking another. The mathematics of that exchange could be calculated in ways that demonstrated the action's necessity without eliminating the reality of its consequences. Some moments demanded responses that changed the people who provided them. The measure of a man was not whether he could avoid such moments, but how he lived with their aftermath when avoidance proved impossible. Isaiah continued serving as Bumpy Johnson's shadow for another decade, maintaining his position through the turbulent years that transformed Harlem and the nation during the 1960s. His reputation preceded him now in ways that his previous anonymity had never allowed. Potential threats deterred by awareness that the quiet man behind Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated willingness to kill when circumstances required it. The weapon he carried remained holstered throughout those years, never again needing to be drawn, its potential alone sufficient to prevent situations where its use might become necessary. The historical impact of that single second in February 1958 extended far beyond the immediate survival of Bumpy Johnson and the immediate death of Marcus Webb. Bumpy's continued leadership maintained black control of Harlem's underworld for another decade, preventing the Italian expansion that would have transformed the neighborhood's criminal economy and the community that depended on it. The conspiracy's exposure led to reforms within both the police department and the criminal organizations that had collaborated in the failed plot, reforms that reshaped power structures throughout New York's underworld. Isaiah Cole eventually retired from active service, his years of vigilance having preserved a life that had in turn preserved countless others through the stability that Bumpy Johnson's leadership had provided. He lived quietly in Harlem until his death in 1987, a man whose greatest moment had been compressed into a single second that most people would never know about, but that those who mattered would never forget. His legend endured in the stories that circulated through communities where such stories constituted the only history that actually meant anything. The relationship between Isaiah and Bumpy continued until Bumpy's death in 1968, 11 years after the shooting that had proven the depth of Isaiah's commitment. Those years saw Harlem transform around them, the civil rights movement reshaping possibilities that had seemed fixed when both men were younger, the community they protected evolving in ways that their generation could observe but never fully comprehend. Through all these changes, Isaiah remained at Bumpy's side, the shadow that had become a legend continuing to provide the protection that had always been his purpose. Bumpy Johnson was buried with honors that reflected his status in Harlem's community, mourned by thousands who had benefited from his presence even when they disapproved of his methods. Isaiah attended the funeral as he had attended every significant event in Bumpy's life for more than 2 decades, standing at the edge of the crowd with the same quiet watchfulness that had characterized his entire career. The man he had protected was gone, but the duty he had fulfilled would define him until his own death nearly 2 decades later. The truth that Isaiah's second of decision demonstrated was simple but profound. Loyalty isn't measured by what one says, but by what one does when words become insufficient. Protection isn't defined by presence, but by action when presence alone cannot prevent harm. And the hardest choices are not those between right and wrong, but those between terrible costs paid willingly and terrible consequences accepted through inaction. Isaiah Cole made his choice in less than a second. He lived with its implications for nearly 30 years. The stories told about that night grew with each retelling, the details shifting and expanding as stories always do when they pass through communities that value narrative over precision. Some versions claimed Isaiah had killed 3 men that night. Others described a gun battle that never actually occurred. The truth was simpler and more profound than any embellishment could improve. A quiet man had done a terrible thing because the alternative was watching a good man die. That was all. That was everything. That was the night that changed everything. That was the second that made history. That was how a quiet man who never spoke proved that his silence had been strength rather than absence, that his stillness had been preparation rather than passivity, that his loyalty had been absolute in the only way that absolute loyalty can ever truly be demonstrated. Bumpy Johnson survived because Isaiah Cole chose to pull the trigger. Harlem remained what it was because Bumpy Johnson survived, and history bent around a single second when a shadow became a savior and a bodyguard became a legend. The measure of Isaiah Cole was not the killing itself, but what that killing made possible. Bumpy's continued leadership allowed Harlem to maintain its identity through turbulent years when external forces sought to reshape it according to visions that its residents rejected. The protection Isaiah provided extended beyond a single man to encompass an entire community whose fate was intertwined with the survival of its most powerful defender. That was the legacy of February 14th, 1958. That was what 1 second of absolute commitment produced. That was why Isaiah Cole's name would be remembered in Harlem long after the details of his story had faded into legend and myth.